B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, October 7th, 2020. First, they came for the socialists. Then they came for the Jews. And now they've come for QAnon. It was Martin Niemöller who coined those phrases a long, long time ago. And let me be clear from the outset that I am not a defender, a proponent, a supporter of QAnon. I think it's all pretty ridiculous. But there are people who have invested a great deal of faith in the QAnon narrative. Some people dismiss it as a conspiracy theory, and elements of it clearly are. And I have to ask, you may be a person of faith who embraces a religious philosophy or practice that other people might find, well, like a conspiracy theory. And so today, as we analyze the moves by Facebook to totally silence QAnon from its platform, we have to speak up. Now, first and foremost, Facebook does not have to observe the First Amendment. It is a private company. Well, it's public, but it's not a public entity. And because it declares that it is not a publisher, it is viewed as not subject to the First Amendment. And so I'm not making a First Amendment argument here. I'm making one for clarity, consistency, and a rejection of arbitrary moves that reek of political opportunism. So QAnon has clearly gained momentum. Polls show that a lot of people believe this shit. Many of them are conservative Republicans and religious conservatives. And Facebook has belatedly taken action. And Facebook does have the legal right to regulate what is on its platform. But its policies, its community standards, are so incoherent, so arbitrarily enforced, that the first thing I thought of when I heard about the ban of QAnon, all pages, all groups, at Facebook and Instagram, my reaction was, okay, who's next? And lefty independent media has been hammered by the algorithms of Silicon Valley. Craig Murray, in his daily blogging about the Assange extradition hearings in London during September and early October, he found that his traffic has been reduced by as much as 90%. And that is consistent with the corporate media's blackout, almost complete, of these critical hearings about Assange that long-term can impact the right of major media outlets to operate under the First Amendment. And so these issues are interconnected. And I speak up for QAnon the way I did for the odious Alex Jones and others whose expression I don't agree with, approve of, or seek. But I could be next. And reading from the youth-oriented corporate media organ, BuzzFeed, they now refer to QAnon, quote, as a set of outlandish beliefs that first came together in 2017 on an anonymous message board. It was an outgrowth of another conspiracy theory, Pizzagate, which falsely claimed that prominent Democratic politicians were running a child trafficking operation in the basement of a D.C. pizzeria, and they note accurately that the pizzeria doesn't have a basement. So the clear contradictions, the incoherence of the QAnon message, I choose to defend as the right of crackpots to express themselves. And last week, we saw 17 Republicans vote against a resolution condemning QAnon after Congressman Tom Malinowski had received death threats after being given some, I don't know what they call it, but some kind of a Q alert. So I caution you. I know many people just say, oh, good, QAnon. We don't need that. They appear to think that Trump is some sort of a messiah figure. And since we don't embrace that whole idea, QAnon is disposable and dispensable. Now, I hasten to add that I don't know exactly how to police QAnon. But I think it's too late to try to silence them in the hopes that people will just put down their phones and stop looking at 8chan or wherever it is that QAnon congregates these days. They've been kicked out of Reddit. Now they've been kicked off Facebook. Well, we've seen that right-wing hate groups use the chat channels on video games to communicate with each other. And you're not going to stifle this. It will not be squelched. So I do not think this is a positive development. And it just underscores, there is a new report out, and I haven't gotten to including it in a podcast, but a congressional committee is calling for the breakup of some of the big tech companies. And if it's done properly, I support that. In the meantime, broad-based efforts at censorship, in my view, are unacceptable and ineffective. And one more point related to my comment comparing QAnon to religious beliefs. I happen to think that Scientology is a crackpot religion. I don't think it deserves tax-exempt status as a faith group here in the United States. But I defend the right of I almost called them Synanon, Scientology, to exist. And as long as it's operating lawfully and not coercing or compelling people to participate, then I defend their right to organize, to gather as a quasi-religious entity, and I support the right of people who want to be brainwashed into Scientology. You may consider these extreme positions, but I don't think there is a middle ground when it comes to free expression. So there's an interesting, fairly deep dive into QAnon at Mint Press News under the byline of Raul Diego. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. He updates us on the recent activities QAnon influencers, after Trump went into the hospital, immediately set out to decode his tweet to deduce clues from the statement's use of capital letters. Trump goes all caps all the time. I didn't know that was a thing that could be decoded. Diego reports their conclusion reaffirmed their unfaltering belief in the plan that they think Trump is carrying out in order to weed out what they believe is a satanic pedophile network run by the opposing party. Now, I do think John Podesta is, at least as an art collector, he's creepy. But I don't have any evidence to connect him to a pedophile network. That's Jeffrey Epstein. That's Dennis Hastert, the former Republican Speaker of the House. And so these contradictions are not lost on me. And Diego notes that QAnon's newest enthusiasts are coming from police departments across the country. It's called Q Research. And here's a cop quoted, "I'm merely someone who sits on my couch late at night with my dog on my lap, my iPhone in hand, while seeking the truth." In the presence of elements of law enforcement, in the Q world, recast as a backdrop for an absurd tale about the redemption of the country, all point to QAnon being an elaborate psyop to justify internet deplatforming of dissident voices. And on the other hand, potential real-world confrontation between nationalist pro-cop groups and left-leaning contingents of the Black Lives Matter, anti-police brutality crowd to justify a more severe crackdown on civil liberties. This is another reason I am concerned about singling out QAnon and essentially attempting to ban them from Facebook. Later, Diego writes, examination of the broader narrative espoused by QAnon followers reveals a more than passing similarity to the white supremacist canon developed mainly in the South in the late 1970s. That ideology held that the white race was the last line of defense against a secret, powerful cabal of Jewish families and white race traitors that make up the Zionist-occupied government. The Nazi he continues here, the Nazi overtones of the entire Q creed are unmistakable, perhaps no sharper, than in Q's characterization of the Trump administration as the storm, in what is almost certainly a direct reference to both the Nazi stormtroopers and to a white supremacist online bulletin board called Stormfront, which was established back in 1990 and run out of West Palm Beach, Florida. So I think he makes some interesting points and raises concerns about QAnon that you should be familiar with. He notes that a survey from early September reported that 1 in 3 Republicans believe QAnon theories to be mostly true. Another 23% admit that parts of the narrative are real. And since July of 19, awareness about QAnon among the American public has jumped from 65% to 80%. And with that kind of visibility, Facebook's move, I think, is pretty meaningless. So Trump, perhaps because of those steroids he's taking, over the past 24 hours he has tweeted almost 50 times, on average every 30 minutes, about the declassification of documents that he ordered and that his Director of National Intelligence carried out. These are related to the origins of Russiagate. And my guess is that he is impatient because people are voting. This was the October surprise he had in mind, not going to Walter Reed to be treated for COVID and coming back as a resurrected Messiah. At any rate, it's interesting because the so-called liberal corporate media is either ignoring this story entirely or simply dismissing it. You got to go to Fox News to just get the basic information about what has occurred here. But the tweets, which include a lot of caps, which is going to excite some Q followers, include this one. Wow. Now do something about this. This is all caps, by the way. The biggest of all political scandals in history. 3 exclamation points. Biden, Obama, and crooked Hillary led this treasonous plot. 3 exclamation points. Biden shouldn't be allowed to run. Got caught. 3 exclamation points. He also tweeted, they went for a coup. Almost destroyed our country. You had the right president at the right moment. Current voters, remember this when you vote. A disgraceful con artist charges anyone? Taking too long. Media is in on it. A true scandal. Now, as you know, I am one of those weird lefties who is a skeptic of the Russiagate narrative. I don't trust Jim Comey, Jim Clapper, John Brennan, or St. Bob Mueller. But I also don't trust the political operatives who populate the Trump administration, including Bill Barr and John Durham. And I've expressed my discomfort with their political approach to investigating the origins of Russiagate. And I want to thank Jerry Frazia all the way from Lake Como in Italy, who sent me the link to the Fox News story because I don't traffic at Fox and I wouldn't have seen this. I had seen a partisan Democrat post on Facebook last night that the declassification of certain documents had been ordered. John Ratcliffe, the new puppet over at DNI, he said today, at the direction of President Trump, I declassified additional documents relevant to ongoing congressional oversight and investigative activities. And primarily what I see here that Fox has reprinted is a series of heavily redacted pages, some of them purportedly in the handwriting of John Brennan himself, who was CIA director at the time. And really all that remains here of this document is Donald Trump, by stirring up a scandal claiming to come from the Russian security sector, any evidence of collaboration between Trump campaign and Russia, ? And everything else is redacted except some marginal notes with initials, like JC for James Comey, Susan for Susan Rice, and Dennis with one N for Dennis McDonough, who was Obama's final White House chief of staff. And I have to say that I'm not getting much out of this. And I'm hoping that there are far more documents that have been declassified and that will be available for public review. But at this point, it's not terribly substantive. But people who are predisposed to believe that Hillary Clinton engineered Russiagate will probably find this as somewhat persuasive. And the Fox News report references Jim Comey's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee last week. And as Ray McGovern pointed out, and we cited yesterday from consortiumnews.com, the amnesia of Jim Comey is pretty suspect in this context. So I await further disclosures. And I'm open-minded to review the documents and see if they support the notion of a conspiracy by top players in the Obama administration, FBI, national security sector, and the Clinton campaign. First, to try to defeat Trump with the whiff of a Russian scandal, and then after he was installed, or about to be installed, as president, they decided to use it to try to keep him under wraps. So Paul Waldman, I used to have him on my syndicated radio show on a regular basis when he worked for Media Matters. He is a reliable partisan Democrat, and he now has a perch as an opinion writer at the Washington Post. And he used his column today to respond to this release of new information in order to dismiss it, to inoculate his readers, to protect the Post's investment in the Russiagate narrative and the Mueller report. Quote from Waldman, "The fake scandal they're now trying to gin up involves yet another appalling abuse of power by the Trump administration. The fact that they're doing it now shows something else, their remarkable failure to get people to hate Biden. Despite the fact that Biden has weaknesses many believed would make him a disastrous nominee, the mask he assiduously wears in public might as well be made of Teflon. If you're a resident of the right-wing media bubble, you've been told of late that the thing you should be angry about right now is a convoluted story about 2016, the latest attempt to prove that no one should ever have been concerned at all about Russia's interference in our election, and the Trump campaign's enthusiastic cooperation with it." So instead of reporting the facts in a news column, the Post is content to let its opinion writers denounce it. And Margaret Sullivan, who used to be the public editor, they called her, at the New York Times, she now covers the media beat at the Washington Post. And she offers some advice here that is not specific to these newly declassified documents about Russiagate. They relate to the impact of Trump's lies about the dangers and the potential rigging of mail-in balloting. And she cites a new major study and concludes it's the American mainstream press that is doing most of the dirty work, not foreign troublemakers trying to influence the election results. And she's singing a song that I love. Analyzing 55,000 stories, 5 million tweets, and 75,000 Facebook posts, the study's authors traced the disinformation campaign to Trump's first tweet on April 8th. Republicans should fight very hard when it comes to statewide mail-in voting. Democrats are clamoring for it. Tremendous potential for voter fraud, and for whatever reason, doesn't work out well for Republicans. So they're now 30% of the U.S. adult population that is less committed politically, less uniformly committed to one or the other proposition regarding fraud and mail-in ballots. And Sullivan cites the use of the truth sandwich. And this is a new term for me. But she uses as an example a Vox article that used the sandwich approach recently with a story that carried this headline: Vote by mail is not full of fraud despite Trump's debate claims. The article itself stated the accurate information first, then took up the false claim, and then fact-checked it. So when you get hungry, grab yourself a truth sandwich and just hope that you don't barf up the false portion in the middle. Now, part of the Republican voter suppression scheme, just like all of Trump's tweets about mail-in balloting, we have a new wrinkle for you. The 8 Republican justices on the Texas Supreme Court ruled today, that the clerk of the state's most populous county, that's Harris County or Houston, may not send out applications for mail-in ballots to all 2.4 million registered voters. They are putting a leash on the Democratic clerk of Harris County, Chris Hollins. He overstepped his legal authority, the court says, by seeking to send applications to all registered voters. And in Texas, you're not allowed to request an absentee ballot unless you're older than 65, you'll be somewhere else on Election Day, you have a disability, or if you're in jail, or if they are crime victims with secret addresses. So Hollins sent out applications to the over 65 contingent, and then he was trying to send them to another 1.7 million when a lawsuit led to this court's decision. And the court said mass mailing unsolicited ballot applications to voters ineligible to vote by mail cannot be said to be necessary or indispensable to the conduct of early voting. And this is clearly a way to prevent people from voting. Last week, we covered that Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, a Republican, issued an order to close all but one drop-off ballot location for completed mail-in ballots, one per county. That's 254 statewide. And Harris County would have to close 11 of their drop-off locations. These are brazen, transparent efforts to stop people from voting. And it's going on all across the country. We can't keep up with all of it. So the cash-strapped Trump campaign is canceling TV ad contracts in key battleground states, particularly in the Midwest. Trump's mostly negative ads have been off the air in Iowa and Ohio. The campaign has just canceled $2 million worth of reserve time in Michigan and Wisconsin. In Minnesota, the team has chopped about $5 million from its projected fall TV budget. So this is interesting because Trump, who had $800 million to start with, has squandered it on all of these legal voter suppression schemes, payments to family members. It appears Brad Parscale got a healthy chunk of the campaign cash. And you'll remember that Trump at one point said, if I need to, I'll shove some money into it. But so far, he's not investing in his own efforts to win a second term. Maybe it's because he doesn't have the cash, which would be consistent with the financial information that was released by the New York Times about a week and a half ago. So my schadenfreude got pretty excited yesterday. After I recorded the podcast, I learned that Stephen Miller has tweeted that he has COVID-19 and is going to quarantine. My immediate thought was, well, can't we just deport him? And ordinarily I am a fairly generous, lowercase Christian kind of guy who doesn't like to celebrate the misery of other people. But in this case, I'm sorry, my restraint does not apply. But some of the ugly moves of Stephen Miller are going to go into effect even in his absence. ICE officials have started to implement a policy that allows officers to arrest and rapidly deport undocumented persons in the United States who've been here for less than 2 years. This effort to expand quick deportations, is this like ICE's version of warp speed? Well, it applies to people who cannot prove that they've been in the country continuously for 2 years before they are picked up. Now, this was blocked by a federal court in 2019 when it was first announced, but this past June, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals lifted the injunction. And they're telling us that they will require lawyers, but not an immigration judge, to review the documents before ICE officers are told to go grab and eject any particular individual. I'm not too mollified by those kind of flimsy requirements. And BuzzFeed, which broke the story based on a whistleblower nurse at the ICE detention center in Irwin County, Georgia, well, they're following up. And while they don't have evidence of any additional unwanted gynecological procedures like hysterectomies, they focus on an immigrant who's detained there named Jennifer Moya Lopez, and last Saturday she had trouble breathing. This is about the time when I think Trump got some fresh oxygen over at Walter Reed. Anyway, she couldn't get attention. She finally got a woman to hold some Vapo Rub under her nose to see if it would help her breathe, but it kept getting worse. Finally, they dispatched a nurse who dismissed her concerns and said she was just having a panic attack. Moya Lopez said, well, no, this is not any kind of emotional or neurological issue. This is having trouble breathing. So they did give her some oxygen, and then they offered her the opportunity to go into solitary confinement, which she reportedly declined. Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee have demanded an explanation for why Trump's Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett didn't disclose a newspaper ad to them that carried her signature and called for an end to the barbaric legacy of Roe v. Wade. We have reported on this ad that was published in Indiana when she was teaching at Notre Dame. She and her husband both signed on to it, and it is evidence of her deep bias against abortion rights. She has made up her mind, and we know she's going to go before the Senate Judiciary Committee and just dance around that. Say, oh, Senator, I haven't made up my mind. I'll wait and see the facts and evidence before me. But the Democrats say the failure to disclose that 2006 letter leads to additional questions about other potentially missing materials, and they demand that those be coughed up pronto. Yesterday, we reported on Amy Coney Barrett's links to the People of Praise group, that she stayed at a home owned by one of the founders in Indiana, in South Bend, while she was attending law school at Notre Dame. Her husband lived in the same house before they were married. Mitch McConnell is really pissed. He is slamming the media outlets, including The Guardian, for reporting this. Okay, these are just facts, Mitch. And he went on to say, this is reference to, in this cult, they refer to the female members as handmaids. And some people falsely think that Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale, was based on this religious cult. That's not really true. McConnell said the word handmaid appears dozens of times in the King James Bible. It was good enough for the Virgin Mary. But now, because one liberal author put it in the title of an anti-religious novel in the 1980s, the press tries to imply that one of the most brilliant, powerful women in the legal world is anti-women. That's not quite the claim that's being made, but okay, Mitch. He went on to say that our coastal elites are so disconnected from their own country that they treat religious Americans like animals in a menagerie. All right, I'll plead guilty. Coastal elite. Life is always good for billionaires, and then it gets better. The billionaire drug cult, or drug cartel, run by the Sackler family under the corporate name Purdue Pharma, they're the ones who made billions on OxyContin and other opioid drugs. Well, they're about to sign on to a deal where they'll cough up some billions of dollars. Just based on broad numbers, the family is reported to be worth $13 billion, and they've agreed to cough up somewhere around $8 billion. But a lot of that's corporate money. It's not their personal assets. Representatives of the Sackler family members have no immediate comment. But what's most important to me is that whatever money they get out of the Sacklers and Purdue needs to go to run programs to help people deal with opioid addiction. They criminally and negligently allowed millions of Americans to get hooked on these powerful drugs. And to me, that is the top priority for any of the proceeds that the Sacklers have to give up. And just to put some numbers on it, the world's billionaires, and the year's not even over, have increased their fortunes to $10.2 trillion. A report by the Swiss bank UBS found that billionaires increased their wealth by more than a quarter, 27.5%, between April and July. Their aggregated wealth has surpassed the previous peak of $8.9 trillion, and as I mentioned, it's at 10.2. The number of billionaires has also hit a new high. There are 2,189 of those mofos. And a couple of examples. Jeff Bezos, his wealth has increased by $74 billion so far this year. And Elon Musk, the bad boy who runs Tesla and the Boring Company and SpaceX, his fortune increased by $76 billion. And I don't know if that factors in the settlement he made with his ex-wife. Because at one point he was supposed to be worth, I think, $150 billion, but it's hard to keep track. Want to recommend a commentary by John Kiriakou published today at consortiumnews.com. And he wants people to be aware he is not trying to persuade people not to vote for Joe Biden for president, but he wants to open your eyes to some of the people who have endorsed Biden and who have his ear. And front and center is one of the most dangerous neocon madmen who is still alive, John Negroponte. And he, of course, has endorsed Biden. Kiriakou calls him the Darth Vader of American foreign policy of the past half-century. He cites his bloody work in Honduras during the Iran-Contra affair, ambassador to the United Nations as we marched into war in Iraq, director of national intelligence during George W. Bush's torture program. Negroponte explained why he's endorsed Biden. He said, "All roads lead to Trump, and I'm just not sure the country can withstand another 4 years with a man who has shown such a disregard for the office." And Mike Hayden, who was head of the CIA and head of the NSA, he's the one who developed massive domestic surveillance that's still in place. I don't celebrate the fact that he had a stroke, but he struggles to speak in a new TV ad where he endorses Joe Biden at the expense of Donald Trump, and it's pretty personal. And so I think that John Kiriaku's words should be heard, including this: "The last thing I would do is urge anybody to vote for Donald Trump. He's been a disaster in every sense of the word in both foreign and domestic policy. But Biden is no panacea. He's a center-right placeholder, and Negroponte has confirmed that." Alan McLeod at MintPress News has a great piece. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. And it's critical of the so-called Abraham Accord. This is the deal that Trump has announced, and he mischaracterizes it as a peace deal. He got Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates to warm up their relations with Israel. You can now fly from Israel to those two countries. And I think McLeod correctly points out that this is the basis for creating a regional alliance for the purpose of attacking Iran. And he notes the Abraham Accord appears to have been deeply unpopular with the people of the UAE and Bahrain, who risk serious consequences if they protest their decision on social media. The governments justified it by claiming they had guaranteed that Israel would not annex the Jordan Valley on the West Bank, as it had announced. But Netanyahu's made it clear that he has simply delayed that move. And one of my favorite people in Washington, Phyllis Bennis, who's at the Institute for Policy Studies, and she's written a handful of primers, including Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. She's quoted here: "The notion that this was somehow a peace deal implies that somehow this fabulous deal, Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain, were somehow now at peace. Oh, wait a minute. That until this fabulous deal, those countries were somehow not at peace but at war. And that is simply not true. They had very good ties. They had commercial, trade, and security ties that go back decades. But they were always very quiet because the official position of the Arab League and the actual position of Arab populations were strongly opposed to normalization with Israel as long as the oppression of the Palestinians continued." McLeod notes that this is mostly about selling advanced arms, including drones, to these other nations. We previously had restricted them to Israel, and this will lead to an arms race in the region that can enable a war against Iran. Also linked in today's show file is the latest installment from the Gray Zone Project, based on what's going on at the United Nations, and the remarkable testimony by the former Director General of the Organization for Prevention of Chemical Weapons. And in today's article, Aaron Mate details the testimony of Ian Henderson, he's still there, a veteran OPCW inspector. And Henderson, who disclaimed any political alliances, he's a scientist who was sent to investigate the incident at Douma, Syria. Well, he's been attacked and ignored by the United States, Britain, and French diplomats whose governments bombed Syria over the allegations of a chemical release at Douma. And Ted Postal, one of my favorite people, he's a former MIT professor who has told the truth about drones and about the Iron Dome system, which is largely ineffective, despite Israel's claims to the contrary. Some of the testimony reported yesterday from Jose Bustani, the former chief of the OPCW, is included in this article. Mate notes instead of heeding Henderson's call, the Western diplomats either maligned him or ignored him. Here's a quote from the pretty girl who's Trump's latest ambassador to the UN, Kelly Craft. Quote, "Let's recognize today's demonstration for what it is, a stunt. The question we must ask ourselves is, why is Russia so eager to protect a regime that has repeatedly used chemical weapons against its own people?" Now, the former head of the OPCW, Ian Henderson, they're not Russian. They don't have any alliance with Russia. This is illogical, irrational. It's a response, but it's not an answer. And they got the French ambassador to the UN to trot out and say, "I just regret that today's meeting is reduced to a disinformation exercise. Let me first of all recall the obvious. At the root of today's discussion is the very simple, plain fact that the Syrian regime," and he cites a completely different incident, August of 2013, gassed 1,300 men, women, and children to strengthen its military hand. Now, I'm not even sure what event he's referring to there. But it's not relevant, and it's disingenuous to cite that as a way of dismissing the testimony that's been presented to the Security Council. And Professor Postal is quoted here, "I have not in my experience seen such a disservice to international law as I've witnessed here today. The UN is an important international vehicle for enforcing international law, and if you people are not interested in facts, then there can be no justice. Fooling around with these statements, which I'm very familiar with because I've seen them over many years, and not knowing your basic facts, well, I'm not trying to hide my outrage. If I sound angry, I am, because I believe in the UN, I believe in the OPCW, and frankly, the way you guys have behaved today, I don't think you believe in those organizations." And at that point, he stopped himself. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Dave Derby, Siri Walgren, I hope you're getting better there, Siri, Carol Beam, and, oh, there's Carol Beam again. I appreciate your subscriptions here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast. And if you're not a subscriber and you want to change that, all you have to do is click on peterbcollins.com/sign up. Well, the miracle on Pennsylvania Avenue continues because today Trump returned to the Oval Office. Now, he's less than a week into the heavily drug-based treatment of his COVID-19 diagnosis. And I think he's putting people at risk by not, isolating himself to the family quarters upstairs at the White House. But he's an action kind of guy, and he wants you to think that. So there he is at risk to himself and people around him back in the Oval. Nancy Pelosi said the White House is one of the most dangerous places in the country now. I wouldn't go anywhere near the White House. She said on The View. She said that the steroids could have an impact on his thinking. And also she said if you have the coronavirus, it has an impact as well. There are enablers around the president who should really know better. He's rebounding from a terrible mistake that he made yesterday. And that mistake is that impulsively, he ordered Steve Mnuchin to stop negotiating over a bailout package with Pelosi. This despite the pleadings of the chair of the Fed, Jerome Powell. And today we have reports from economists who say the U.S. economy is facing a watershed moment. And Trump's promise of a post-election stimulus bill assumes that the Republicans retain control of the Senate and take back the House, and that he can just issue a decree and his cult members will deliver. And one of his advisors, Larry Kudlow, who's pretty much a putz, he said, well, what Trump was saying yesterday is we're too far apart for a gigantic bill. It's too close to the election. Not enough time to get stuff done at this stage of the game. But they will risk the health of the Senate and ignore the wishes of a majority of Americans by ramming through these SCOTUS confirmation for Amy Barrett. Now Trump is partly reversing himself from yesterday. He's saying he's dying to send out $1,200 checks to Americans. Oh, and he wants to single out the airlines and a handful of other businesses for bailout money. So he's trying to unbundle the package that Pelosi has been working to pass all summer long, since the House passed it in May, and that is the HEROES Act. And so he tweeted, "I'm ready to sign right now. Are you listening, Nancy?" And Pelosi's rejoinder, all the president wants is his name on a check. So it remains to be seen if the Democrats will cave on this. I think at this point they would be better off to hold the line and blame Republicans for failing to pass a relief package. But that gamesmanship to me is secondary to the needs of people who are getting paltry unemployment checks now of a couple of $100 a week. And even if they got a $1,200 check with a giant Trump signature on it, what's that going to do for anybody? That's not going to buy health insurance for people who've lost their employer coverage. It's not going to pay the rent for most people in this country, not even once. But the market recovered the losses from yesterday on the news of Trump's about-face, and we'll just have to wait and see where that goes. But analysts, I think, are accurately saying that the president has risked putting the blame for a lack of a bailout package on the Republican Party. He took ownership of these talks ending by explicitly telling Mnuchin to stop negotiating with Pelosi until after the election. And those are comments from Washington Post op-ed writer Amber Phillips. And here are two Republicans who fit her model. Lindsey Graham says, well, he doesn't quite agree with the president on this one. Strongly recommend all my colleagues and president look at the House Problem Solvers bipartisan $1.5 trillion stimulus relief package. He's in a very tight race for re-election, and he knows that many people in South Carolina are looking to Washington for help. And then there's Republican Congressman John Katko. I'm not sure what state Katko is from, but he wrote, this is pretty strong. He's poking the bear. I disagree with the president. With lives at stake, we cannot afford to stop negotiations on a relief package. The Problem Solvers Caucus has a proposal that both sides agreed on and can bring negotiators back to the table. I strongly urge the president to rethink this move. So these are Republicans who are feeling the heat, and they're also worried that Trump is going to take down the entire Republican Party. Here's today's COVID-19 update, and I'm pleased that Linda Lewis is back gathering information and compiling it for us. As of today, worldwide, almost 36 million cases and 1,050,000 deaths. Across the United States, 7.5 million cases. The death count is now at 210,000, almost 211. We have a total of 7.4 million cases, or, well, another source says 7.5. The reported fresh deaths yesterday at 721. We have 31,000 people currently hospitalized, with 6,400 in the ICU. 38,000 new cases reported today, and that's been a pretty steady number. At Axios, the report is that Trump's cavalier attitude toward the virus is making the pandemic worse in his own backyard. And the reasons are simple. If you can't afford to miss work, and there's no temporary aid to make it feasible for you to keep feeding yourselves and keep a roof over your heads, then you'll keep going to work even if you're infected. Medical News Today reports on research published in a medical journal, the Annals of the American Thoracic Society, that refutes a claim that face masks, reduce the amount of inhaled oxygen or increase the amount of inhaled carbon dioxide. They recruited 15 staff doctors who had no health issues affecting their lungs, and 15 veterans with COPD. They found no clinically significant changes in any of the participants in what's called their end tidal carbon dioxide measurements. They also found no changes in blood oxygen levels after 5 or 30 minutes of wearing a mask. And I've heard all kinds of these dire theories. I'll single out a man whose academic freedom I support, but I disagree with his arguments, Mark Crispin Miller. At least in my email inbox, he's the loudest voice against masks. He claims that they cause people to get sick. And I would think that, if you wear a mask, the same one every day for 6 months, it could actually do that. But the cloth ones you can put in the washing machine, and the paper ones you should discard when they start to stink, if not before. If Mike Pence followed the recommendations of experts, he would not be debating tonight in Salt Lake City. The CDC guidelines are clear. If a person comes into close contact with an infected person, that's 6 feet, within 6 feet for at least 15 minutes, that person should get a test and quarantine for 14 days. So the CDC encourages people to quarantine for the incubation period, regardless of test results or symptoms. And Pence keeps saying he tests negative, he has no symptoms. But it's that kind of cockiness that has led to, 27 people in the White House complex now who are testing positive or sickened? And Linda notes the use of the qualifier known to have, here's the denial. According to his staff, Pence was never in close contact with anyone known to have COVID-19. Well, because the White House refuses to do contact tracing, it's impossible to know who may have picked up the virus from the more than a dozen people exposed at Trump's events. Potentially, there's a large, extended circle of people who have yet to test positive. And that is a compelling argument. Government Executive is a publication describing the dilemma of White House employees who are exposed to Mr. and Mrs. Trump. Of all the employees working on the White House grounds, perhaps no one has more exposure to the first family than the roughly 100 members of the resident staff. Trump and Melania have rarely worn masks. Each time the president has held a rally or speech outside the White House, he's created opportunities for the virus to migrate into the executive mansion. While it's unclear whether staffers' duties have changed during the pandemic, a handful of them usually work quite intimately with the president and the first lady, like butlers, valets, housekeepers, and elevator operators. Pastor John Hagee is in a San Antonio hospital. He is the right-winger who is a big supporter of the Abraham Accords, and that's the last time he went to the White House to attend the session there on September 15th. Well, his son Matt Hagee announced that Daddy, the Reverend John Hagee, tested positive last Friday for COVID-19 and that he is isolating himself in the meantime. A couple of more items. The Boston schools have delayed their reopening. Mayor Marty Walsh had said the city would hold in-person classes if the citywide rate of positive tests remained under 4%, but has ticked up above that, and he is delaying that plan. In Paris, more than 40% of patients hospitalized in intensive care units have COVID-19 now. There has been a significant increase, and there has been a slight increase in deaths reported in the capital region of France. Scotland will further tighten restrictions on its hospitality sector, closing pubs, canceling events around Glasgow. And this is to avoid the likelihood of a second lockdown. Italy has announced a new order to make face masks mandatory around the country as of today. And Governor Cuomo of New York and Mayor de Blasio of the city are being slammed by Orthodox Jews who feel they've been singled out. There were fights, skirmishes along 13th Avenue in a Hasidic neighborhood. The areas impacted are Brooklyn and Queens. Orthodox leaders say they were not consulted by the governor. They're appalled by the action. And a Catholic bishop has chimed in support of the Orthodox Jews. North Dakota is now the biggest hotspot across the country per capita. They have more new cases per capita than any other state. Hospitalizations have risen abruptly, forcing healthcare officials to send people to faraway hospitals, and the death count has risen in North Dakota as well. Some advice for Dr. Robert Redfield, the current occupant as the head of the CDC. His predecessor, Dr. William Fogey, who served under Presidents Carter and Reagan, has told Redfield that he should resign and make a big deal out of it. He said, resigning itself is a one-day story and you will be replaced. But he said you could up front acknowledge the tragedy of responding poorly, apologize for what has happened and your role in acquiescing, set a course for how CDC would now lead the country, and then resign. I agree, it's time for Redfield to go. He is fully compromised and has no credibility. And I don't know if you can remember all the way back to April, but that's when we first heard about Rick Bright over at the National Institutes for Health. Well, he has finally resigned his government post. He was demoted, left with nothing to do. And he's the one who went public as a whistleblower, describing the haphazard approach to getting PPE, the bungled response of the Trump administration, and the risks that all poses to public health. His lawyer said Dr. Bright was forced to leave his position at NIH because he can no longer sit idly by and work for an administration that ignores scientific expertise, overrules public health guidance, and disrespects career scientists. You know, we hear a lot about the Uyghurs in far western China. But there are some Uyghurs who wound up at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And while Barack Obama tried to clear the prison, failed to close it, the fate of 3 of those Uyghurs who used to be at Guantanamo isn't very pretty. 10 years after 3 men were released to Bermuda and Albania, they are unable to join their families, who have since moved to Canada, and it's the Canadians who say that it's their history as prisoners at Guantanamo, even though they were cleared of any connection to terrorism, that prevents Canada from allowing them in the country. And it is pretty tragic. This article in The Guardian points out that these men ended up at Gitmo because they were sold to the United States military for a bounty. They were in Afghanistan at the time. And I bring this up because there's all this talk of the unproven claims that Russia paid bounties to Taliban fighters for killing Americans in Afghanistan. And none of those articles ever mentioned that the United States set the stage for bounty payments. And it's okay when we do it, but not when our purported adversaries do. And finally today, we say farewell and happy trails to a crooner and reggae fan.
I can see clearly now the rain is gone. I can see all obstacles in my way.
Those are the vocal stylings of one Johnny Nash.
Gone are the dark clouds that had me blind.
Johnny Nash died in Houston Tuesday at the age of 80. He's one of the people responsible for popularizing reggae music here in the United States. And at one point after his big hit, I Can See Clearly Now, from the mid-'70s, he moved to Kingston, Jamaica,
I think I can make it now.
and worked with Bob Marley.
All of the bad feelings have disappeared.
happy trails to Johnny Nash.
Here is that rainbow I've been praying for. It's gonna be bright.